who decided the fates of kings, wars, and empires. Picture this: a tiny temple at the foot of Mount Parnassus. Above it, swirling mist. Within, a woman in trance, uttering incoherent phrases. Yet these very words brought chaos to nations and elevated empires to greatness. The oracle of Delphi, sacred voice of Apollo, or clever manipulation. For entire centuries, priests and priestesses prophesied destinies. But who were they really?
Male mediums.
Political strategists? Or something else entirely? Today we attempt to understand who truly dictated the fate of Greece. Deep in the mountains of ancient Greece, where eagles soared above sacred peaks and gods supposedly walked among mortals, there existed a place that would shape the destiny of civilizations. This was not a battlefield where armies clashed, nor a palace where kings held court. It was a simple stone chamber, shrouded in mystery, where a single woman's voice could topple dynasties or launch 1,000 ships. The Oracle of Delphi stood as the most powerful religious and political institution of the ancient world, yet its true nature remains one of history's most perplexing enigmas. For over a millennium, pilgrims traveled from across the Mediterranean to seek counsel from the Pythia, the high priestess who served as Apollo's earthly voice. Kings postponed wars, colonists chose new lands, and philosophers pondered existence based on her cryptic utterances. But beneath the sacred rituals and divine proclamations lay questions that echo through time. Was this truly the voice of a god, or something far more earthly and calculated? Historical context. The sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi emerged from the mists of the 8th century BCE, rising from what had once been a sacred site dedicated to the earth goddess Gaia. According to myth, Apollo himself had slain the great serpent Python that guarded this primordial oracle, claiming the site as his own. The Greeks believed this location to be the Omphalos, the navel of the world, where two eagles released by Zeus from opposite ends of the earth had met in flight. The oracle's influence began modestly in the Archaic period, when the cult of Apollo was still taking shape. Early prophecies were brief, cryptic utterances that required careful interpretation. The Pythia, always a woman chosen from among the local population, would enter a trance-like state and deliver pronouncements that priests would then interpret and relay to supplicants. These early oracles dealt primarily with religious matters, purification rituals, proper worship practices, and divine approval for local customs. As Greek civilization flourished, so too did Delphi's power and influence. The sanctuary became wealthy beyond measure, adorned with treasures donated by grateful city-states and individuals whose fortunes had been guided by the oracle's wisdom. The site expanded beyond the simple temple to include a theater, stadium, and numerous smaller shrines and monuments. Most significantly, the Sacred Way, a winding path leading up to Apollo's temple, became lined with elaborate treasuries built by various Greek polis to house their offerings to the god. The classical period marked the zenith of Delphic authority. During the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, the oracle became the de facto spiritual capital of the Greek world. No major decision was made without consulting the Pythia first. When the Athenians faced the massive Persian invasion under Xerxes, they sent envoys to Delphi before determining their response. The oracle's advice, to trust in wooden walls, was interpreted as guidance to rely on their naval fleet, leading to the decisive victory at Salamis that saved Greek civilization. The oracle's political influence extended far beyond military matters. When Greek city-states established colonies across the Mediterranean, they first sought Apollo's blessing through his Delphic representative. The god's approval legitimized these ventures and provided divine sanction for territorial expansion. Entire cities owed their existence to oracular guidance, and their founding myths invariably included tales of Delphic prophecies that had guided their ancestors to new lands. The process of consultation followed strict protocols that had evolved over centuries. Supplicants could not simply arrive and demand an audience with the Pythia. They first had to undergo purification rituals, offer appropriate sacrifices, and often wait for auspicious times determined by the temple's calendar. The oracle operated only on specific days, typically once a month during the warmer seasons, when Apollo was believed to be present at the shrine. During winter months, the god was said to travel to the land of the Hyperboreans, leaving Delphi under the temporary guardianship of Dionysus. The political implications of this system were profound. By controlling access to the oracle, the Delphic priesthood wielded enormous influence over Greek affairs. They could delay crucial decisions by restricting consultation dates, or elevate certain supplicants by granting them privileged access. The priests who interpreted the Pythia's often incoherent utterances held the power to shape the meaning of divine will, translating divine madness into practical policy. During the Hellenistic period, as Greek independence waned under Macedonian and later Roman rule, Delphi's influence began to decline. The oracle continued to function, but its pronouncements carried less weight in a world where political power had shifted to distant capitals. Roman generals and emperors occasionally consulted the Pythia, but more often as a diplomatic courtesy than from genuine belief in her prophetic powers. The sanctuary's decline accelerated during the Roman imperial period. Emperors like Nero plundered Delphi's treasures, removing hundreds of statues and works of art to decorate Roman villas and public spaces. The oracle's responses became increasingly theatrical and elaborate, perhaps compensating for its diminished political relevance with heightened dramatic effect. By the 2nd century CE, even sympathetic observers like Plutarch, who served as a priest at Delphi, noted the oracle's reduced activity and questioned whether the gods still spoke through earthly intermediaries. The final centuries of the oracle's existence were marked by growing Christian influence throughout the Roman Empire. The old gods were increasingly viewed as demons or mere superstition, and the oracular practices that had once guided Greek civilization were dismissed as fraud or demonic deception. Imperial edicts gradually restricted pagan worship, cutting off the financial support that had sustained Delphi for centuries. The last recorded consultation of the oracle occurred in the late 4th century CE, when Emperor Julian the Apostate's physician sought guidance about his master's campaign against the Persians. The response was appropriately final. "Tell the king that the fair-wrought hall has fallen to the ground. Apollo has no longer a hut, nor a prophetic laurel, nor a speaking fountain. Even the speaking water has been quenched." With these words, the voice that had guided Greece for over 1,000 years fell silent forever, leaving behind only stones and memories of a power that had once shaped the destiny of nations. The final phase and mysterious disappearance. The twilight of the Delphic oracle unfolded not with dramatic revelation but with the slow suffocation of belief itself. As the Roman Empire embraced Christianity, the sacred fires that had burned for Apollo gradually dimmed, their smoke no longer carrying prayers to Olympian heights but dissipating into an increasingly indifferent sky. The transformation was neither sudden nor complete. It crept through the sacred precincts like morning mist, obscuring familiar landmarks until they became unrecognizable. By the 2nd century CE, visitors to Delphi noted disturbing changes. The crowds of pilgrims that had once thronged the sacred way had dwindled to scattered groups of curious tourists and die-hard believers. The Pythia's prophetic sessions, once scheduled monthly during the active season, became irregular and increasingly infrequent. Contemporary accounts describe a priestess who sometimes emerged from the inner sanctum claiming that Apollo was absent, that the god had not spoken, that the sacred vapors had failed to induce the necessary trance. The Roman historian Dio Chrysostom, writing in the early 2nd century, observed that the oracle's responses had become verbose and theatrical, abandoning the cryptic brevity that had characterized earlier pronouncements. Where once the Pythia had delivered enigmatic phrases that required careful interpretation, she now offered elaborate verses that seemed more concerned with poetic effect than prophetic power. Critics suggested that the priests had begun composing responses in advance, transforming divine revelation into literary performance. The financial foundation of the oracle's power eroded alongside its spiritual authority. Roman emperors, particularly those hostile to Greek culture, systematically looted Delphi's treasures. Sulla removed gold and silver offerings to fund his military campaigns. Nero's agents reportedly carried away over 500 bronze statues from the sanctuary. Each theft diminished not only the temple's wealth but also its symbolic potency. The accumulated offerings of centuries represented the collective faith of the Greek world, and their removal suggested that this faith was no longer valued or protected. Local communities that had supported the oracle for generations began to redirect their resources toward new religious and civic institutions. The maintenance of the complex temple infrastructure required enormous ongoing investment, from the upkeep of sacred buildings to the support of a substantial priestly hierarchy. As pilgrims brought fewer offerings and wealthy patrons looked elsewhere for spiritual guidance, the practical machinery of oracular consultation began to break down. The priesthood itself underwent profound changes during this period. The rigorous selection and training processes that had produced generations of skilled ritual specialists gave way to more casual appointments. Ancient sources suggest that finding suitable candidates for the role of Pythia became increasingly difficult, as educated women from prominent families were no longer willing to dedicate their lives to a declining institution. The sacred knowledge that had been carefully preserved and transmitted through generations of priests began to fragment and disappear. Archaeological evidence reveals that the temple complex fell into disrepair during the 3rd century CE. Earthquake damage went unrepaired, buildings were abandoned, and the elaborate water systems that had supplied the sacred springs were allowed to deteriorate. The famous sacred spring itself, which had supposedly provided the pure water necessary for ritual purification, ran dry or was diverted for secular use. Without these physical foundations, the ceremonial framework of oracular consultation collapsed. The rise of Christianity introduced not merely a competing religious system but a fundamentally different understanding of divine communication. Christian theology viewed oracular practices as either fraudulent or demonic, explicitly rejecting the possibility that pagan gods could provide legitimate guidance. Church fathers like John Chrysostom preached that the oracle's supposed prophecies were the work of demons deceiving the faithful, while Christian emperors issued edicts forbidding pagan worship and closing ancient temples. The decisive blow came in 392 CE when Emperor Theodosius I issued comprehensive legislation banning all pagan religious practices throughout the Roman Empire. This edict specifically targeted oracular consultation, divination, and the maintenance of pagan temples. The legal foundation for Delphi's existence was thus swept away by imperial decree, transforming the sanctuary from a legitimate religious institution into an illegal cult site. Yet the oracle's final silence was not achieved through legal prohibition alone. By the time of Theodosius's edict, the institution had already been mortally wounded by decades of neglect, skepticism, and cultural transformation. The last recorded consultation may have occurred years or even decades before the official ban, as the practical machinery of oracular consultation had already ceased to function effectively. The physical site of Delphi did not immediately become uninhabitable. Christian communities established churches in the vicinity, sometimes incorporating stones from the ancient temple into their new buildings. The town that had grown up around the sanctuary continued to exist, though its residents now looked to bishops rather than priests for spiritual guidance. The Sacred Way, once crowded with pilgrims bearing offerings for Apollo, became a quiet mountain path leading to abandoned ruins. Local memory of the oracle's former power persisted in folklore and legend long after its official suppression. Mountain villages preserved stories of the prophetic woman who had once spoken for the god, though these tales gradually became divorced from their historical context. The Pythia transformed from a historical figure into a mythical archetype, a symbol of feminine wisdom and divine mystery that would inspire later generations of poets and storytellers. The disappearance of the oracle's written records remains one of history's great losses. The temple presumably maintained extensive archives documenting centuries of consultations, including the original questions posed by supplicants and the exact wording of the Pythia's responses. These documents, if they survived the sanctuary's decline, would have provided invaluable insight into the oracle's methods and the political context of its pronouncements. Their absence leaves modern scholars dependent on second-hand accounts and literary reconstructions of oracular practice. Some ancient sources suggest that the oracle's final prophecies were deliberately obscure, even by traditional standards. The Pythia allegedly warned that the age of divine communication was ending, that the gods were withdrawing from direct involvement in human affairs. Whether these cryptic final utterances represented genuine prophecy or merely the self-aware commentary of a dying institution remains impossible to determine. The mystery of the oracle's disappearance thus encompasses not only the cessation of its activity, but also the complete erasure of its institutional memory. Unlike other ancient religious sites that were gradually abandoned or transformed, Delphi seems to have deliberately obscured its own history, leaving behind only the stones of its temples and the echoes of its former authority. This silence, perhaps more profound than any prophecy, continues to challenge our understanding of one of antiquity's most influential institutions. Theories and hypotheses. The enigma of the Delphic oracle has spawned numerous theories attempting to explain both its apparent prophetic powers and its ultimate disappearance. Each hypothesis offers a different lens through which to view this ancient institution, yet none provides a complete or entirely satisfactory answer to the fundamental questions surrounding its operation and influence. The traditional religious explanation presents the oracle as a genuine conduit for divine communication. According to this view, the god Apollo literally spoke through the Pythia during her trance states, providing authentic prophetic guidance to supplicants. Ancient sources universally support this interpretation, describing the oracle as a sacred intermediary between the mortal and divine realms. The consistency of this account across different time periods and authors suggests a widely accepted belief in the oracle's supernatural origin. This religious interpretation gains credibility from the oracle's demonstrated influence over historical events. If the prophecies were merely fabrications or educated guesses, it seems unlikely that such a system could have maintained its authority for over a millennium. The oracle's pronouncements often led to significant political and military decisions, suggesting that ancient Greeks had good reasons to trust in its reliability. The elaborate ritual framework surrounding oracular consultation also indicates serious institutional investment in maintaining divine communication. However, the religious explanation faces substantial challenges from modern perspectives. The mechanics of divine communication remain unexplained, and the oracle's pronouncements, when examined closely, often display characteristics more consistent with human knowledge than supernatural revelation. The prophecies frequently contained information that could have been deduced from careful observation of political and military developments, suggesting that divine inspiration may have been supplemented by earthly intelligence. The political manipulation theory proposes that the oracle served as a sophisticated instrument of Greek statecraft, with the Delphic priesthood deliberately crafting responses to serve specific political agendas. Under this interpretation, the priests possessed extensive networks of informants throughout the Greek world, allowing them to stay informed about political developments and craft prophecies that would influence events in desired directions. This theory finds support in the oracle's consistent alignment with successful political outcomes. The priesthood's advice often favored outcomes that would strengthen Greek unity or promote stability in the region. The oracle's support for Greek resistance against Persian invasion, for example, could be interpreted as patriotic calculation rather than divine revelation. The institution's ability to provide guidance that proved politically beneficial suggests sophisticated strategic thinking rather than mere religious ritual. The practical advantages of this system were considerable. By presenting political advice as divine command, the oracle could promote necessary but unpopular decisions while insulating political leaders from direct responsibility. The cryptic nature of many prophecies allowed for multiple interpretations, enabling the priesthood to claim vindication regardless of how events unfolded. This flexibility made the oracle a valuable tool for managing political uncertainty and legitimizing controversial decisions. Yet, the manipulation theory requires assuming a level of systematic deception that seems difficult to maintain over centuries. The oracle's reputation depended on its perceived authenticity, and widespread knowledge of deliberate fraud would have destroyed its credibility. The theory also fails to explain how the priesthood could have maintained such extensive intelligence networks without detection, or why rival political factions would have continued to consult an oracle known to be manipulated by their enemies. The medical and geological explanation attempts to provide a naturalistic account of the Pythia's trance states by identifying physical causes for her altered consciousness. Modern geological surveys of the Delphi site have revealed the presence of underground fissures that could have released gaseous emissions, including ethylene and other compounds known to produce hallucinations and altered states of consciousness. These natural emissions could have induced the trance states that ancient sources describe. This theory gains substantial credibility from archaeological and geological evidence. The Temple of Apollo was constructed directly over a geological fault line, and soil samples from the site contain elevated levels of various gaseous compounds. The symptoms described for the Pythia's trance states, including convulsions, incoherent speech, and apparent dissociation from normal consciousness, are consistent with exposure to these natural intoxicants. The geological explanation also accounts for the oracle's eventual silence. If the prophetic powers depended on natural gas emissions, changes in underground geology could have gradually reduced or eliminated these emissions over time. Earthquakes, common in the region, could have sealed the fissures that provided the gaseous foundation for the oracle's trance states. This would explain why the oracle's activity declined gradually rather than ending abruptly. However, the medical explanation leaves important questions unanswered. While it may account for the Pythia's altered states of consciousness, it does not explain how her incoherent utterances were transformed into coherent and often accurate prophecies. The theory also fails to address why the oracle's responses demonstrated apparent knowledge of distant events and political developments that could not have been deduced from trance-induced visions alone. The feminist interpretation of the oracle emphasizes the unique role of women in this ancient institution. The Pythia was always female, and she held a position of extraordinary influence in a predominantly male-dominated society. This theory suggests that the oracle provided a legitimate channel for feminine wisdom and intuition to influence political and religious decisions, effectively giving women a voice in public affairs that they were otherwise denied. Archaeological evidence supports the significance of female religious authority in ancient Greece. The Pythia's role was not merely ceremonial but involved real decision-making power, as her pronouncements carried legal and political weight. The selection process for the Pythia emphasized personal character and spiritual qualification rather than family connections or wealth, suggesting that the position was based on merit rather than social status. The gender dynamics of the oracle may also explain its distinctive characteristics. The cryptic, intuitive nature of many prophecies differs markedly from the logical, systematic approach typically associated with male political discourse. The oracle's emphasis on moral and spiritual considerations, rather than purely pragmatic calculations, may reflect feminine perspectives on leadership and decision-making. Nevertheless, the feminist interpretation must account for the fact that the oracle operated within a male-dominated religious hierarchy. The priests who interpreted the Pythia's utterances were exclusively male, and they controlled access to the oracle and managed its institutional relationships. This suggests that whatever feminine influence the oracle provided was filtered through male intermediaries who shaped its final expression. The psychological and anthropological explanation views the oracle as a sophisticated mechanism for managing collective anxiety and uncertainty. From this perspective, the institution served crucial social functions by providing authoritative guidance during times of crisis and legitimizing difficult decisions through divine sanction. The oracle's ambiguous prophecies allowed communities to project their own hopes and fears onto divine pronouncements, creating a sense of cosmic order and purpose. This theory finds support in cross-cultural studies of oracular practices, which appear in various forms across different societies facing similar challenges. The human need for guidance and meaning in the face of uncertainty seems to generate similar institutional responses across cultures and time periods. The oracle's longevity and influence suggest that it successfully addressed fundamental psychological needs that transcended specific historical circumstances. The anthropological approach also explains the oracle's distinctive characteristics. The emphasis on ritual purification, the remote location, and the elaborate ceremonial framework all served to create a sense of sacred authority that enhanced the psychological impact of the prophecies. The oracle's cryptic language forced supplicants to engage in active interpretation, making them psychological participants in the prophetic process rather than passive recipients of divine instruction. However, the psychological explanation risks reducing the oracle to a mere social mechanism, potentially overlooking genuine spiritual or supernatural dimensions of the institution. It also fails to account for the oracle's apparent accuracy in predicting specific historical events, unless one assumes that the prophecies were sufficiently vague to accommodate multiple interpretations after the fact. The mystery of the oracle's disappearance adds another layer of complexity to these various theories. If the institution was indeed a sophisticated political tool, why was it abandoned rather than adapted to changing circumstances? If it depended on natural geological phenomena, why did ancient sources describe its ending in terms of divine withdrawal rather than physical causes? If it served crucial psychological functions, why did these needs suddenly disappear or find alternative outlets? The convergence of multiple factors, religious, political, geological, and social, suggests that the oracle may have been more complex than any single theory can explain. Perhaps the institution's power derived from the successful integration of various elements: genuine spiritual experience, political calculation, natural phenomena, and social psychology. The oracle's ultimate disappearance may have resulted from the breakdown of this delicate synthesis, as changing circumstances undermined the conditions that had sustained its authority for centuries. Archaeological evidence and material traces. The archaeological investigation of Delphi has yielded a treasure trove of material evidence that illuminates the oracle's operations while simultaneously deepening the mystery surrounding its true nature. Excavations conducted since the late 19th century have uncovered not only the physical infrastructure of the sanctuary but also artifacts that provide tantalizing glimpses into the daily practice of oracular consultation. The Temple of Apollo itself, reconstructed multiple times throughout antiquity, reveals the evolution of the oracle's institutional development. The earliest temple, dating to the 7th century BCE, was relatively modest in scale, suggesting that the oracle's influence grew gradually rather than emerging fully formed. Subsequent reconstructions, particularly the magnificent 4th century structure whose ruins dominate the site today, demonstrate the enormous wealth and political importance the sanctuary had attained by the classical period. Archaeological investigation of the temple's inner sanctum has revealed the famous Adyton, the sacred chamber where the Pythia delivered her prophecies. This small, windowless room was constructed directly over a natural fissure in the bedrock, supporting ancient accounts that describe the oracle's trance states as induced by vapors rising from the earth. The floor of the Adyton shows evidence of repeated modification and repair, suggesting intensive use over many centuries. The most significant discovery relating to the oracle's methodology came from geological surveys conducted in the 1990s. Researchers identified active seismic faults running directly beneath the temple, along with evidence of hydrocarbon gas emissions that could have produced the intoxicating vapors described in ancient sources. Soil samples revealed elevated concentrations of ethylene, a sweet-smelling gas that can induce euphoric states and hallucinations when inhaled in sufficient quantities. These geological findings provide compelling support for the medical explanation of the oracle's trance states. Ethylene was used as an anesthetic in modern medicine before being replaced by safer alternatives, and its effects on human consciousness are well documented. The gas produces feelings of euphoria, dissociation from normal awareness, and sometimes auditory or visual hallucinations, symptoms that closely match ancient descriptions of the Pythia's behavior during prophetic sessions. However, the archaeological evidence also reveals the limitations of purely geological explanations. The sacred spring that supposedly provided pure water for ritual purification has been identified and studied, but analysis of its water reveals no unusual chemical properties that would account for altered consciousness. The elaborate drainage systems discovered throughout the sanctuary suggest that the priests carefully managed water flow for practical rather than mystical purposes. The material culture of oracular consultation is preserved in thousands of small offerings discovered throughout the sanctuary. These votive deposits include miniature bronze tripods, representing the sacred seat of the Pythia, as well as figurines depicting supplicants in attitudes of prayer or consultation. The artistic quality and precious materials of many offerings demonstrate the high social status of the oracle's clientele and the serious investment they made in securing divine guidance. Inscriptions found throughout the site provide direct evidence of the oracle's consultations, though frustratingly few record the actual prophecies delivered. Most inscriptions are dedicatory, thanking Apollo for favorable outcomes or commemorating successful enterprises undertaken with oracular approval. The famous maxims inscribed on the temple walls, "Know thyself and nothing in excess," suggest that the oracle promoted philosophical reflection as well as practical guidance. The archaeological record also documents the oracle's international reach through architectural evidence. The sacred way leading to Apollo's temple is lined with treasuries built by various Greek city-states to house their offerings to the god. These elaborate structures, many decorated with sculptural programs celebrating military victories or colonial foundations, demonstrate that the oracle's influence extended far beyond local religious practice to shape interstate relations and cultural identity. One of the most intriguing archaeological discoveries is the absence of written records. Unlike other ancient religious sites that have preserved extensive archives of ritual texts, administrative documents, and oracular pronouncements, Delphi has yielded virtually no written material directly relating to the oracle's operations. This absence could result from the deliberate destruction of records during the Christian period, the use of perishable materials for record-keeping, or the possibility that the oracle's pronouncements were preserved primarily through oral tradition. The few inscribed oracles that do survive often appear on dedicatory monuments rather than in archival contexts. These inscriptions typically present the prophecies in polished verse form, raising questions about their relationship to the original utterances of the Pythia. The literary quality of these texts suggests that they may have been refined and elaborated by the priesthood for public consumption, making it difficult to reconstruct the authentic voice of the oracle. Excavations have also revealed evidence of the oracle's institutional infrastructure. The sanctuary included extensive residential quarters for the priesthood, storage facilities for offerings and ritual equipment, and administrative buildings for managing the complex logistics of oracular consultation. This material evidence demonstrates that the oracle was not simply a religious phenomenon but a sophisticated organization requiring substantial resources and professional management. The discovery of lead tablets containing questions from supplicants provides rare direct evidence of the oracle's consultation process. These tablets, found in various locations throughout the sanctuary, preserve the exact wording of inquiries submitted to the oracle. The questions range from personal matters, requests for guidance about marriage, career, or health, to major political issues affecting entire communities. The formal language and careful preparation of these tablets suggest that supplicants took the consultation process very seriously. Archaeological investigation has also documented the oracle's decline and eventual abandonment. Stratigraphic evidence shows that the sanctuary's activity decreased markedly during the Roman period, with fewer offerings, reduced maintenance of buildings, and the gradual accumulation of debris in previously well-maintained areas. The final phases of occupation show signs of hasty abandonment, with valuable objects left in place and ritual equipment scattered throughout the sacred buildings. The Christian period at Delphi left distinctive archaeological traces. Early Christian communities established churches within the sanctuary complex, sometimes incorporating stones from pagan temples into their new buildings. These churches were modest in scale compared to the magnificent pagan structures they replaced, suggesting that the Christian community at Delphi was much smaller than the crowds that had once attended oracular consultations. Modern archaeological techniques have revealed additional layers of complexity in the oracle's operations. Ground-penetrating radar has identified underground chambers and passages that may have been used for ritual purposes or to create special effects during prophetic sessions. These hidden spaces could have allowed priests to manipulate the oracle's environment in ways that enhanced the mysterious atmosphere of consultation. The archaeological evidence, while extensive, ultimately raises as many questions as it answers. The material remains confirm the oracle's importance and provide insight into its operations, but they cannot resolve the fundamental question of whether the prophecies were genuine divine communications or sophisticated human constructions. The stones of Delphi preserve the framework of oracular consultation but remain silent about the source of the oracle's apparent power. Perhaps most significantly, the archaeological record demonstrates that the oracle was embedded in a complex network of religious, political, and economic relationships that extended throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. The material evidence reveals not a simple religious shrine, but a sophisticated institution that played a crucial role in the political and cultural development of ancient Greece. This institutional complexity suggests that understanding the oracle requires examining not just its prophetic pronouncements, but also its broader social and political functions. The ongoing archaeological investigation of Delphi continues to yield new discoveries that refine our understanding of the oracle's operations. Recent excavations have uncovered additional areas of the sanctuary, revealing the full extent of the religious complex and its supporting infrastructure. These discoveries confirm that the oracle was one of the most important and influential institutions of the ancient world, even as they deepen the mystery surrounding its ultimate nature and purpose. Mystical explanations and legends. Beyond the realm of historical analysis and archaeological evidence lies a shadowy landscape of mystical explanations and folk traditions that have surrounded the Delphic oracle since antiquity. These alternative interpretations, while often dismissed by academic scholarship, reveal persistent human intuitions about the oracle's nature that transcend conventional historical categories. The legends and esoteric theories that have accumulated around Delphi speak to dimensions of the oracle's influence that cannot be captured through purely rational analysis. Local traditions in the mountains surrounding Delphi have preserved memories of the oracle that diverge significantly from classical literary accounts. Shepherds and farmers in the region pass down stories through generations describing the Pythia not as a religious functionary but as a figure of elemental power, connected to forces that preceded human civilization. These folk memories speak of a woman who could communicate with the spirits of the mountain, who drew her knowledge from sources older than Apollo himself. The oral traditions describe strange phenomena that accompanied the oracle's operations. Locals reported unusual weather patterns during prophetic sessions, sudden mists that enveloped the sanctuary, unexpected temperature changes, and electromagnetic disturbances that affected metal objects throughout the area. Animals, particularly birds and snakes, allegedly behaved unusually during oracular consultations, either fleeing the vicinity entirely or gathering in unprecedented numbers around the temple precincts. These accounts, while impossible to verify historically, suggest that the oracle's influence extended beyond human society to encompass the natural world itself. The legends describe the sanctuary as a place where the boundaries between different realms of existence became permeable, where the normal laws of cause and effect were suspended in favor of more mysterious forms of connection and communication. Medieval chroniclers, writing centuries after the oracle's disappearance, preserved fragments of traditions that presented the Pythia as a figure of cosmic significance. These accounts describe her as a guardian of ancient knowledge, a keeper of secrets that predated recorded history. According to these sources, the oracle's prophecies drew upon a vast reservoir of wisdom that had been accumulated over millennia, a cosmic library of understanding that transcended individual human consciousness. The mystical interpretation of the oracle's disappearance presents it not as a simple historical transition but as a cosmic event with profound implications for human spiritual development. According to this view, the oracle's silence marked the end of an era when divine communication was direct and accessible, ushering in a new age characterized by spiritual struggle and the necessity for individual rather than collective revelation. Some esoteric traditions have linked the oracle to ancient mystery schools and secret societies that allegedly preserved and transmitted occult knowledge throughout history. These theories suggest that the Delphic priesthood was part of a network of initiates who maintained contact with non-human intelligences or accessed consciousness states that transcended normal human limitations. The oracle's cryptic pronouncements, from this perspective, were encoded messages that revealed their true meaning only to those who possessed the proper interpretive keys. The persistence of these mystical interpretations reflects deeper questions about the nature of consciousness and communication that conventional historical analysis cannot address. If the oracle's influence was based solely on political manipulation or natural phenomena, why did it inspire such profound spiritual responses in those who encountered it? Why did the institution continue to fascinate and influence human imagination long after its historical functions had ended? Contemporary paranormal investigators have reported unusual phenomena at the Delphi site that echo ancient accounts of the oracle's mysterious powers. Visitors describe experiences of temporal displacement, where the modern ruins seem to transform into their ancient appearance, populated by figures in classical dress performing mysterious rituals. Electronic equipment allegedly malfunctions in specific areas of the sanctuary, particularly near the remains of the Ataton where the Pythia once delivered her prophecies. These modern accounts, while lacking scientific verification, demonstrate the continuing power of the oracle's legacy to evoke extraordinary experiences. The site itself seems to retain some quality that transcends its historical significance, suggesting that the oracle's influence operated on levels that cannot be fully explained through conventional analysis. The mystical traditions surrounding the oracle also emphasize its feminine nature as a key to understanding its power. Unlike the masculine-dominated religious and political institutions of ancient Greece, the oracle represented a form of authority that was fundamentally feminine in character. The Pythia's power derived not from logical argumentation or physical force, but from intuitive insight and receptivity to influences beyond ordinary consciousness. This feminine dimension of the oracle has been interpreted as evidence of its connection to archaic goddess religions that preceded the classical Greek pantheon. The site's original association with Gaia, the earth goddess, suggests that the oracle may have preserved elements of prehistoric spiritual traditions that were later incorporated into the cult of Apollo. The persistence of feminine religious authority at Delphi, despite the patriarchal nature of Greek society, indicates that the oracle drew upon sources of power that could not be easily suppressed or controlled. The legend of the oracle's final prophecy has become a central element in mystical interpretations of its disappearance. According to various traditions, the last Pythia delivered a cryptic pronouncement that predicted not only her own silencing but also the eventual return of oracular wisdom in a new form. This prophecy allegedly described a future age when direct divine communication would be restored, but through individual rather than institutional channels. The mystical understanding of the oracle's legacy extends beyond historical curiosity to encompass ongoing spiritual practices and beliefs. Modern practitioners of various esoteric traditions claim to have restored contact with the oracle's wisdom through meditation, channeling, and other consciousness-altering techniques. These contemporary oracles, while lacking the institutional authority of their ancient predecessor, assert that they maintain access to the same sources of knowledge that once spoke through the Pythia. The question of whether these mystical interpretations represent genuine spiritual insight or merely romantic projection cannot be definitively answered through conventional analysis. However, their persistence across cultures and centuries suggests that the oracle touched upon fundamental aspects of human consciousness that transcend specific historical circumstances. The institution's power may have derived not only from its political and religious functions, but also from its ability to provide access to non-ordinary states of consciousness that revealed aspects of reality normally hidden from human perception. The mystical dimension of the oracle's legacy thus challenges us to consider possibilities that extend beyond the boundaries of conventional historical explanation. Whether these possibilities represent genuine spiritual phenomena or psychological projections, they remain an integral part of the oracle's continuing influence on human imagination and spiritual aspiration. The silence that descended upon Delphi may have ended one form of divine communication, but it also opened space for new forms of spiritual exploration and understanding. The legends and mystical traditions surrounding the oracle remind us that history encompasses more than the documented actions of political and religious institutions. The deeper currents of human spiritual experience, while difficult to verify through conventional methods, may provide essential insights into the nature of consciousness and reality. The oracle's true legacy may lie not in its historical influence, but in its continuing capacity to inspire questions about the ultimate nature of knowledge, communication, and human potential. Conclusion and reflection. The Oracle of Delphi stands as one of history's most enigmatic institutions, a phenomenon that defies easy categorization or explanation. For over a millennium, this ancient sanctuary wielded influence that shaped the destiny of civilizations, yet its true nature remains shrouded in mystery. The various theories we have examined, religious, political, medical, social, and mystical, each illuminate different aspects of the oracle's operations while failing to provide a complete or entirely satisfactory explanation. What emerges from our investigation is not a single truth, but a complex tapestry of interconnected factors that contributed to the oracle's extraordinary influence. The institution's power may have derived from its ability to synthesize multiple elements: genuine spiritual experience, sophisticated political intelligence, natural phenomena, psychological insight, and perhaps dimensions of reality that transcend conventional understanding. The oracle's disappearance may have resulted from the breakdown of this delicate synthesis, as changing historical circumstances undermined the conditions that had sustained its authority for centuries. The question of who truly dictated Greece's destiny through the oracle remains tantalizingly unanswered. Was it the god Apollo speaking through his earthly representative? Was it a council of priests manipulating public opinion through calculated prophecies? Was it the collective unconscious of Greek civilization expressing itself through ritual and symbol? Or was it something else entirely, a phenomenon that transcends our current categories of understanding? Perhaps the oracle's greatest legacy lies not in the specific prophecies it delivered, but in the questions it continues to pose about the nature of knowledge, authority, and communication. The institution challenged the boundaries between human and divine, individual and collective, rational and intuitive. It created a space where the normal rules of cause and effect were suspended in favor of more mysterious forms of connection and influence. The oracle's silence, which has persisted for over 16 centuries, may be as significant as its ancient pronouncements. This silence forces us to confront fundamental questions about the sources of wisdom and guidance in human affairs. In an age when traditional religious authorities have lost much of their influence, and when scientific rationalism struggles to address the deeper questions of meaning and purpose, the oracle's legacy reminds us that human beings have always sought connection with sources of knowledge that transcend individual consciousness. The mystery of the Delphic oracle ultimately reflects the mystery of consciousness itself. How does awareness arise from matter? How do individuals access knowledge that seems to transcend their personal experience? How do communities create institutions that channel collective wisdom? These questions, which the oracle embodied rather than answered, remain as relevant today as they were in ancient Greece. The stones of Delphi preserve the framework of an institution that once guided the course of history, but they cannot reveal the source of its power. The inscriptions record the formal procedures of oracular consultation, but they cannot capture the essence of the prophetic experience. The archaeological evidence documents the oracle's operations, but it cannot explain the mechanism of its influence. The mystery remains intact, inviting continued investigation and speculation. In the end, the Oracle of Delphi may represent something that cannot be fully explained or understood, only experienced and wondered at. Its legacy lies not in definitive answers, but in the persistence of questions that challenge our assumptions about the nature of reality and human potential. The voice that once spoke from the sacred precincts of Apollo may have fallen silent, but the questions it raised continue to echo through the corridors of human consciousness, demanding attention and response. The Oracle's story reminds us that history encompasses more than the documented actions of political and military leaders. It includes the deeper currents of human spiritual experience, the collective search for meaning and guidance, and the eternal human quest to understand our place in the cosmos. Whether the Oracle represented genuine divine communication or sophisticated human artifice, it touched upon fundamental aspects of human nature that transcend specific historical circumstances. As we stand at the threshold of new technologies that promise to revolutionize human consciousness and communication, the Oracle's legacy offers both inspiration and warning. It reminds us that the search for wisdom and guidance is a fundamental human drive that will find expression in whatever forms are available. It also warns us that the power to shape opinion and influence behavior through claims of superior knowledge carries profound moral responsibilities. The Delphic Oracle, in all its mystery and complexity, remains a testament to the human capacity to create institutions that transcend the limitations of individual understanding. Whether its prophecies were divinely inspired or humanly constructed, the Oracle succeeded in channeling collective wisdom and providing guidance during crucial moments in human history. Its disappearance marks not only the end of an ancient institution, but also the closing of a chapter in the story of human spiritual development. The question of who truly dictated Greece's destiny through the Oracle may never be definitively answered. Perhaps that is as it should be. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, continuing to challenge and inspire future generations. The Oracle's greatest prophecy may be its own silence, which speaks to the limits of human knowledge and the enduring mystery of consciousness itself. In seeking to understand the Oracle, we ultimately seek to understand ourselves. And in that quest, the ancient priestess of Apollo continues to guide us toward questions that may be more important than any answers we might find.